Let's discuss the difference between a meaningful plot hole and a meaningless plot hole. But before we start, of course, definitions. A plot hole refers to any inconsistency in a story's events, either the logic of the world or the world building itself. And it can show itself in many ways, for example, a character not acting the way they should, or rather how they've been portrayed to react previously. Okay, while all plot holes may seem similar on the surface, their impact on the story differs. A meaningful plot hole has to be something that affects the story to its narrative core. For example, its themes, character development, or central conflicts, while a meaningless plot hole are basically minor inconsistencies that don't really harm the overall story. And while I don't like to put this as a standard, but it usually is the type of stuff that usually goes unnoticed by the audience. So a meaningless plot hole is basically the ancient art of nitpicking. I want to put emphasis on the fact that a meaningful plot hole significantly damages the story, to the point that it will make the story feel disjointed and even nonsensical. These plot holes make the audience basically question the very foundation of the story itself. So an example of this would be a story that contradicts its central premise. So imagine a mystery novel where the plot hinges on a character being unable to unlock a door because they lost the key. Throughout the narrative, the key's loss is treated as the central obstacle the plot revolves around, and the character's attempts to regain entry to the room is central. So now, if later in the story, the character suddenly remembers that the way to open the door isn't to unlock it with this key, but it's a different type of door entirely that you're supposed to push, the entire premise of the narrative falls apart. The audience can feel cheated, as the obstacle that drove the plot in the end is rendered meaningless. And so in that way, it's a meaningful plot hole because it destroys the story's central premise. So the equivalent of this in existing media would be if Luffy from One Piece were to gain an ability or a device that could restrict someone's free will and therefore bending them to his will, and then using those people so that he can become the king of the pirates and the freest man in the world. This would fundamentally circumvent the themes of freedom that Luffy embodies. But of course, I must say that all this is under context. So it's not the fact that you did this that would ruin your story, but it's basically how you do it. So using the example of Luffy again, if he does gain such a device or ability, but he uses it to, yes, restrict other people's will, but through doing that, they gain more freedom, then it would still be perfectly in line with the story's themes of freedom. And if I were to make an example of what that would look like, it would be, for example, if we goes to an island where in this land, people are able to just kill each other and steal from each other. And so Luffy comes in and says, okay, no longer any of that. That would mean that because of that restriction that he's introduced into this island, the people now have the freedom to not fear for their lives and can live peacefully in that way because they no longer have to fear that anyone can just kill them at any moment. And with the stealing part, it would mean that people gain the right of possession so they can actually fully own something, because there would be repercussions to something being stolen now. And so in that way, you are putting a restriction on something, but you gain more freedom in something else. Another example that we can have from another series would be the Naruto series. And let us say that Naruto Uzumaki chooses to circumvent his main themes of the story by not choosing to understand his opponents or the people around him. And so what would break the story wouldn't be the fact that this took place, but it would be that the world does not punish him for doing so. Examples of this would be when Naruto did not try to understand Sasuke and why he was leaving. He wasn't able to save him on his first try, and as we know, it ended up being an entire journey into achieving Sasuke's return. And in that journey, a lot of people were killed by Sasuke. The Raikage lost his arm, and Sasuke almost started a revolution. And then there was Naruto not choosing to understand Kabuto, which later on led to Kabuto running amok during the 4th grade Shinobi War, making it an unnecessarily more difficult fight than it had to be. And while there were positives that came from this, there was an overwhelming negative that was the result of that. So with the One Piece example, it was about its execution, and then in the Naruto example, it is about if the story, the narrative itself, agrees with his actions and if it punishes him or not. And so a meaningful plot hole would have to fundamentally undermine the stories to the very core, where there is no explanation, there is no way out. Imagine in a novel, a character stating that a certain city is 100 kilometers away, only to then later in the story say that it's 150 kilometers away. So while this is a factual error, it doesn't have a meaningful impact on the story. Obviously, even with this example, I'm talking in context. If the whole story is based off of the fact that this character has a perfect memory and their whole thing is that they're able to judge the distance of things perfectly and consistently every time, then of course, yes, then you can consider it a plot hole. But if it's a story that hinges on the character's journey and motivations, then it is meaningless, or rather at best a minor annoyance rather than a truly narrative breaking flaw. And again, with the audience, this is not the standard, but it's not the type of flaw that would stop the audience from enjoying the story and reflecting on its deeper themes. Meaningless plot holes also extend to background details in large stories. For example, in a complex story like science fiction and fantasy with insanely extensive world building, it is possible that minor inconsistencies in the background might arise. An example of this would be if in a sci-fi story, the main character's home planet has been told to be on the outskirts of the galaxy, or rather not the main character, a character, but later that same planet is mentioned, that it is the center of all trade routes. So while these details are factually contradictory, they don't detract from the larger narrative about that character's personal journey and the broader thematic concerns of the story. And of course, as I said before, that this is all about context. If the planet being backwater and on the outskirts is central to how the protagonist grew up or the character grew up and fuels their want of adventure and exploration, then of course it is a meaningful plot hole. But if it was just something of a backstory that's not tied in any way to the character, then it is meaningless. So in this case, the plot hole might be seen as a product of the author's oversight or the complexity of the world building, but it doesn't fundamentally impact the audience's emotional engagement or narrative enjoyment of the story. The concept of explaining a plot hole, or something that can be perceived as a plot hole, is usually seen when the plot hole has something to do with violating the world building rules. For example, a character who's been stated maybe to have a low magical output, for example, if this is a fantasy world, and now is able to output incredibly powerful spells. Or if that fantasy world said that to execute such powerful spells requires a number of spellcasting words, maybe it'll dance and chant. But then later on you see everyone is able to achieve these powerful spells without doing any of that. So in those cases, the most important thing to remember is if all these events are happening without explanation. And I'm actively refraining from saying good or bad explanation because those can be fundamentally subjective terms. I would rather say that the explanation needs to make sense. So whether we like it or not, the explanation needs to be something that fundamentally makes sense to the world that has been built. So in the examples I've given of this fantasy world, this would be perhaps that the character who has started out with a very low magical ability has grown over time, or reveals to have found a crystal where their energy can be stored so that they can release it in bursts when necessary. Or perhaps it has been previously established when it comes to the chants and the spells that over time, as proficiency grows in the specific spells, that shortcuts can be used, maybe less words, a shorter dance, or completely cutting out a lot of the requirements. So basically I'm explaining to you context, and context usually solves most plot holes, especially when it comes to world building. And of course that the concept of meaningful plot holes needs to be held off, or rather the claim of them needs to be held off until the very end of the series, as a novel or manga in this case can introduce something that is a plot hole in chapter 50, but then by chapter 500 it all comes back and we finally get the explanation to what happened in chapter 50. This video, what really inspired it was noticing that there are a lot of videos online where they are naming plot holes that can very well be called meaningless plot holes, or they are meaningful plot holes but are treated as if it doesn't matter, but it's usually the former rather than the latter. This video goes into the concept of constructive and destructive or versus destructive criticism. Well, that should be it. I hope you enjoyed this video.